Do we really have a free press? This is kind of a follow-on to my blog on do we really have free speech? Well, I'm not sure if we do have a free press. This topic was kind of inspired by the fact that Channel 4 News were complaining because Nigel Farage stopped them from attending a Brexit Party rally, and they said he was behaving like a fascist. And they say that the same thing about Donald Trump, because he pushes back against the press and because he sometimes throws people like Acosta out. They say this is fascistic behavior and he's cracking down on a free press. So I kind of think this is nonsense, because for a start, when Nigel Farage stopped Channel 4 from coming in, it was probably because they were reporting in an extremely biased and underhanded way. But also, he did not stop them from reporting. They were free to go back to their station, to write up a report and to report anything they wanted. They could have spoken to people who attended his rally. They could have seen recordings of the rally. They could have received transcripts. And to be honest, most of the rallies, pretty much the same thing would have been said. It wasn't like they were missing out on some amazing revelation. They had plenty of avenues to access that information, even if they weren't in there. And the key point here, they were not being stopped from reporting anything they wanted, and that's the key. Now, the Donald Trump or Nigel Farage are physically stopping or censoring the press. They're not issuing D notices or trying to manipulate what the press are putting out there. All they are doing is providing a little bit of a pushback against an increasingly biased left-wing activist press with a globalist agenda. That's not the same as cracking down on the press. So let's look at press freedom. Well, you can't really say you have press freedom when there's a monopoly. There are lots of puppets, but very few puppet masters, because the control mechanisms for all the press are in the hands of very few people, and they tend to all have the same interests. And therefore, via their various editors and sub-editors, they are pushing narratives. Because journalists aren't free to report what they want to report. Whatever they write up has to pass the editor, has to pass the sub-editor, their line manager. There's the legal department. There's a whole system of controls to vet what actually comes out. So reporters don't just follow their noses and do reporting, do they? They're generally told what they have to go looking for and what they should rather turn a blind eye to. Because freedom of the press is not only what you don't report, it's not what you do report or how you report it. It's also what you choose to ignore has a big influence on it. I feel these days as well, we don't really have investigative journalists. All journalists really do these days is report what official sources say. So they'll stand out outside a police station or a government department, and they will tell you that we heard from the official source, blah, blah, blah. Or they get a press release and then they report on the press release, which could have come from a think tank or wherever. So you have to question, have they gone out and found numerous different independent sources for a story, or have they just taken what was given to them from the government or from a press release from a person or a press office or a think tank and reported it verbatim without checking it out and without questioning it? Because I feel a lot of the times the reporters merely regurgitate what is being told to them by an official source, and they don't look at it themselves and say, wait a minute, does this make sense? Does this chime with what independent witnesses have told us? Does the timeline make sense? No, there's no kind of checking. There's no interrogation of what's been given to them. It's just a regurgitation of what's been given to them. And so that's not really a free press. The next thing is, I used to have this argument with Ian Collins on Twitter about kind of fake news. And he said that there's no such thing. He said every single thing that comes out, for example, of the LBC newsroom is fact-checked, like thoroughly, over and over again, to make sure that it's factually correct. Yes, but what is a fact? In many cases, one newspaper reports what another newspaper said, what Reuters said, what AP said. It's an incestuous citations cabal where they're all just quoting each other, and none of them are culpable because they can all say, oh, well, I heard it from him. Oh, but I heard it from him. There's a whole chain. And in some cases, they are reporting from sources that are not reputable. How many times did I read an article on Sky News that said the source was the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which sounds very fancy, but it's a guy in Coventry who sells T-shirts, and he basically gets on the phone to his friends in Syria who all have an agenda because they're anti-Assad. They tell him some stories, and he regurgitates it to the press. These are not verifiable stories. In fact, it's hearsay times 10. If it's a courtroom, you can't have hearsay. You must have, prima facie evidence or direct evidence from a witness, many times what they are reporting to you is second, third-hand information that is not checked against many other statements. So, look, you really can't take that seriously. Then you get to the point of facts are often in dispute. And we only need to look at the Skripal case to know that. I mean, Novichok, what are the facts about Novichok? First, we were told it's as deadly as BS gas. Next thing, oh, well, it degrades very quickly once it's on the surface, and then it becomes not very dangerous at all. We were told if you were in any of the locations where the Skripals were, double bag your clothes, don't even take them to the dry cleaners. And then we're told, well, just use baby wipes to wipe off your handbag and your sunglasses or whatever. Right. We saw people with hazmat suits all totally kitted out, spraying and hosing things down. At Zizzi's, they burnt the table, they burnt all the uniforms of the staff. But at the bed and breakfast where they stayed, and it was nothing was done at all. Staff continued to clean, people continued to stay in that bed and breakfast. It was tested, it was full of traces of Novichok, unless the public weren't even confirmed until 6 months later in the September, where the public even informed that they'd stayed there. So somehow there was this overkill on some places like Zizzi's, and a total lack of any precautionary measures at all at the guest house where people were staying. So therefore, I ask you, what is actually a fact? The other thing that I'll say is, in many situations, particularly in terms of a terror attack, if we even look at 9/11, where does all the information come from? It all comes from official sources. It comes from the FAA, it comes from the FBI, it comes from the CIA, because the ordinary average person who's a witness doesn't have the forensic tools, wouldn't have been able to know who was on the passenger manifest, wouldn't have known the technical details. The gift of investigating the technical details is with the government, and they release all the information. So you really can't be sure how reliable it is because it never undergoes an interrogation. If there was ever a trial, for example, then of course the defense attorney gets a chance to bring his own witnesses and to cross-examine, and then you can see how what the police have said, what the police have concluded, and what their experts have included, how the veraciousness of it, how accurate is it, how robust is it. But when there's no court trial, and many of these events that happen never actually come to trial, we have to just accept what the official sources like the police, like the government, tell us, without having independent experts be able to maul through everything and figure out all the loopholes, all the mistakes, all the oversights. So you never really get that process, so you can't be sure that the information you're getting is any good. Then, like I say, where are these sources? Are they think tanks? Are they NGOs? Are they independent sources? So many of these so-called sources where they get their facts have an agenda. So do various experts who receive funding, and their livelihoods rely on them continuing to get that funding, which relies on them putting a certain narrative forward. And I think the other thing that goes on as well is whenever any story is reported, the press decide first, what is the kind of narrative we want to push? So when Oscar Pistorius had that really unfortunate incident, it was tragic, and Reeva got killed, the press looked at that, and from day one they decided this is domestic violence, and this is a case of an enraged, jealous lover killing a supermodel. They decided what it definitely wasn't is that crime in South Africa is very, very bad. People have guns and accidents do happen. No. And despite all the evidence, they totally went for that narrative. So, it was jealous, crazed lover against supermodel rather than a extremely neurotic, disabled man in a crime-ridden country killing his girlfriend who was a catalogue model. So you can see the narrative. And with Amanda Knox, they decided right at the beginning that it was going to be a story of a satanic sex orgy gone wrong. And they stuck with that because that sells papers. Now, who ever heard of anyone having a satanic sex orgy gone wrong? I guess it does happen in Bilderberger. Probably does happen in the elite circles, right? But with us ordinary folk, nah, really not buying it. So I conclude that the press really isn't free. They have their agenda and they report the facts that suit their agenda, and the facts are often kind of questionable. So it's not that Trump or Farage are pushing back or creating or limiting a free press. We just don't have such a thing anyway, do we?